Yes, thank you. So I wanted to tell you today about the conspiracy theories, because this is getting more and more urgent to understand why people are so naive and why they believe in all kinds of nonsense without really checking facts and being a bit more skeptical. So I'll talk about memes and neuroscience, and this is a very nice area where we try to understand why some things became viral. And memetics is one of these fields that has failed to explain things and just stayed at the level of cultural studies, not really being connected to real science. So it would be more fun if I could just tell you about all kinds of conspiracy theories, as psychologists or sociologists do. But I will try to focus on science and our understanding on how the whole human behavior depends on the many levels of various phenomena. That is the multi-level phenomics. I want to talk very briefly about memetics and psychological perspective, which is dominating in this area, and then about the brain states and memory formation and hippocampus role in formation, and then about some computational simulations to simplify how we can actually understand what happens in the brain. And finally, I'll show you my model of conspiracies in our brain, and maybe mention direct brain to brain communication perspective. So I've tried to work on that for many years, but nobody wanted to listen. And as we know, well, we observe behavior, and this behavior is sometimes very strange. All kinds of conspiracies, the beliefs, and the division of political ideas. And this behavior depends on our brain, obviously. And the brain has many, let's say, features that will determine behavior. But one of the most important ones is how things are connecting, how long axons are connecting different parts of the brain. We can try to simulate that and, well, first do some measurements, understand this connectivity and functional connectivity, and then try to simulate it to understand it. And that obviously depends on how neurons are built and how they connect to each other. So we have cognitive phenotypes, behavior, and all kinds of beliefs, and then formation of memory in the brain. And then neurodynamics, which is responsible for our behavior. And when we look in details at neurons, we see all kinds of phenomena at molecular level. We see that there is a communication which depends on the ion channels, receptors, and ions flowing in and out. And these channels and the whole cells are, of course, built from proteins, and proteins are, of course, produced because of this complex genetic machinery that we have. So from this neural level, neural properties, we go to synapses, receptors, ion channels, neurochemicals, proteins, and genes. Very complex picture. And when we try to explain our behavior, well, it depends on things that happen at the scale of milliseconds and shorter. And then we can look at all kinds of scales of minutes, days, months, years, millennia, and even eons, which is the evolutionary perspective. Lots of things that influence our behavior. There's a great book by Robert Sapolsky, Behave, which tries to follow this kind of time perspective, saying, why did I do things? What happened in the last second before I have made some actions, and the last minute and days, etc. And so people try since maybe 15 years or so to really look at all the levels which can determine our behavior, from the behavioral top level and all kinds of disease, etc., down to the genetic level and protein level, and try to understand the whole mechanism behind that. And they say, okay, what the medical staff has been usually doing, they will just give you pills and hope that this is going to change behavior. But we don't understand what happens at different levels and how this thing work, how the mechanisms work. So in the middle of all this complexity that we can see here, we have a network level, which is how neurons communicate and how that is related to brain structures. But if we want to understand how neurons communicate, we have to go down to the molecular level, how cells are built, synapses work, ion channels, and finally proteins and genes, etc. So what people tried to do was to create a kind of a description which is not based on just observations of symptoms, but on the regulation of large-scale systems that control our behavior. For example, well, there is a lot of cognitive systems related to attention mechanisms, memory, working memory, perception, language, etc. And then all kinds of, well, emotion-related, negative valence, frustration, threats, loss, etc. And then positive valence like reward learning, reward efforts, expectancy, etc. General arousal, circadian rhythms, the day and night rhythms, sleeps, wakefulness, and then social kind of processes, which is perception of myself in relation to others, my place in the society and other things like that. And finally, there is a sensory motor domain. So there are large domains, and we try to understand how these domains are regulated by different mechanisms in the brain. But first, let me tell you how people have tried to understand the passage of information and thought that they can actually understand how we create our worldview, our conceptual frameworks. Richard Dawkins has written a book, The Selfish Gene, which became very famous, and it was in 1976. Evolution requires three processes: inheritance, variation, and selection pressure. And so he thought, okay, how are cultural ideas, practices, behaviors transmitted? How are all these memes that we have now in the internet, which he didn't imagine at that time in 1976? How is that transformed into something that becomes viral and sticks to our mind? And so he said, maybe we have to define kind of information unit like we have a genetic units, which will code the proteins, which will build our organisms. What is building our mental world somehow? Maybe we have to introduce some kind of information units that will also undergo variations, rapid selection, pressures, and create something which is kind of, analogous to genetics, but which relates to the cultural world and mental world. And so people try to, well, describe what happens in terms of memes, which would be information units. And then they said, okay, they may be grouped into larger units like memplexes. And this is a collection of different cultural units of information, ideas that form symbiotic relationships, set of ideas that reinforce each other. And it could be political ideology, it could be specific subculture, like, followers of certain musical performances and groups, etc. It could be the sport lovers, and it could be religious groups, etc. So they try to analyze the meme pools or the main ideas that are kind of forming population that is controlling the behavior. And they created memetic engineering, which tries to create memes using engineering principles. All kinds of fake news producers are really based on this memetic engineering ideas. And of course, people in optimization, evolutionary computation, people have created all kinds of algorithms based on these ideas, how memes are spreading. And from time to time, people are so overwhelmed with these memes and overtaken by the memplexes that they start to, focus on, that they become memoids. That is, the people who are completely, focused on the memes and don't believe anything else, and so even their own survival becomes inconsequential, and they become a kind of a suicide bombers, cult followers, kamikazes, etc. And so memes have been proposed as a scientific discipline in cultural studies and as a center of a theory of mind. But unfortunately, there is nothing rational about memes, and people have never came up with, ideas that could connect that to hard science, right? So psychologists have focused on the reasons why people believe certain things and what kind of errors of judgment they do, why they are not rational. So they've studied the human behavior and all kinds of errors of human judgment. And they found that people have all kinds of biases, and it could be biases related to the fact that there is too much information and we just cannot handle everything, that there is not enough meaning because information is vague. We need to act fast, so we select something without really thinking it deeper. What should we remember? Well, the selection processes and the attention processes are very difficult. So psychologists have found that there are like 880 biases or more that you can see here. And there are 2 Nobel Prizes given for this kind of research. Daniel Kahneman got the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 2002 for his ideas of bounded rationality. We're rational, but it's not really, absolute rationality. We are biased by lots of things. For example, confirmation bias. I tend to believe things that confirm what I already know. That is very universal. And then Richard Thaler has got a Nobel Prize in 2017 for his work on decision making and especially on nudging. That is how to influence people, pushing them slightly, or nudging as it's called, so that they are following certain behaviors. Very interesting work on psychological side. And important for economics, and the whole field of neuroeconomics have been expanding since that time, about 20 years ago. So for communication and passing the memes between people, we need a shared conceptual space, which is necessary to understand, read, and write with comprehension. We need this core ideas that are common to all people, that will define the common cultural code. There is an organization called Core Knowledge Foundation that has been working in US and UK, and from kindergarten to the end of elementary school, they try to define what are the core ideas that everybody should know so that we can communicate with each other. And the communication space helps us to understand the common concepts, etc. That's a very nice area again, but I don't have time to focus on that. So the question is, what kind of a conceptual grid do we have? There is a great fellow, a Polish fellow actually, in Australia, who is producing all this kind of maps like physiology of excellence. And he just shows different concepts and how they relate to each other in forms of this kind of graphics. Very nice. So now we have natural language models, for example, the OpenAI GPT-3, Google Switch Transformer, etc., which have billions of parameters. Google Switch Transformer has like 1,600 billions of parameters. Incredibly complex. And this is trained on the texts, and so the system can actually, seeing some words, can put them in the context very precisely and use them in a meaningful way. Then once we have this general kind of pools of concepts, then we can specialize the system to create models in specialized domains. So words or concepts activate the brain and enable segmentation of our experience. And without the symbols, the words that we are used, there will be a constant flow of states. very limited planning, poor space for understanding what is happening. This is what you can create when you switch off your left hemisphere, actually, through this procedure that people have sometimes been using called WADA test. Where they will freeze the part of the brain that is using the symbolic knowledge. And suddenly people do some things, but they are in a flow and they cannot really say what they're doing. Very strange states. So conceptual framework are very important. And of course, now we have all kinds of these strange ideas, which are simply put forward and people, well, want to believe. Well, I've just heard today one member of the Russian Duma who says, I just want to believe that we are good guys, right? Nothing can change that. There is no, empirical evidence that can change my beliefs. And people believe all strange things about 5G, about COVID, about Donald Trump, about the aliens, and well, this is shocking. This part here. In 1994, when people were doing all kinds of tests about how political values are, which political values are important, they thought that Democrats and Republicans in US are not that far from each other. In 2017, the gap is enormous. Now, our political biases are so strong that we just cannot talk to each other anymore. And that's obvious all around the world, not just in the US. So why is that happening? And what is happening with our brains and how technology has influenced our brains that we cannot talk to each other anymore? Well, there's lots of research on conspiracy theories done by, for example, a European Union cost network on comparative analysis of conspiracy theories, the Compact Group. I've tried to correspond with them. They have gathered people who do research in history, sociology, psychology, political sciences, and wanted to generate a thorough comprehension of the history, politics, sociology, rhetorics, psychology, conspiracy theories, of conspiracy theories needed to counter their often harmful effects on democratic values. That looks very nice, and they have produced 800 pages of handbook of conspiracy theories, and a book series of conspiracy theories, and completely ignoring the brains and neurobiological mechanisms. They've produced some, well, UNESCO has produced, based on their research, some infographics on how to deal with conspiracy theories, etc. But unfortunately, these people have no idea about science. They're not interested how that happens and how technology is influencing our brains and what happens in our brains. And so I've tried to correspond with them and just got a response. No, we are people, in literary studies, history, sociology. We're not interested in the brain. Okay, I like what I know, and I know what I like, and I'm not going to change that. The problem is that consolidation of new memory states in the cortex of our brain may occur quite quickly if they form strong connections to other memory states or to our conceptual network. There are papers that has been written already 50 years ago on schemas and memory consolidation. So we know a bit about memory consolidation, although that research has been done rather more on the animals, mostly rats. And that's the problem with neuroscience, that what I'm talking about is at the psychological level, and neuroscience has problems doing experiments at this, well, psychological level. Most people tend to work on the lower level and do animal research. But of course, we have all kinds of neuroimaging and do experiments with people also. So this should be possible, right? So neural models of schemes and sequences of associations may be based on neural network attractor states. And I will just say a few words about that. And episodic and semantic memory states are based on activation of synchronized distributed networks of different brain regions. And we know that all these simple explanations are very rewarding because we don't have to think anymore. We just save energy for thinking, create false impressions, feeling special that we have understood something that has been hidden from the public. Now we know the truth, and we don't have to, well, to force our brain to understand anything else. So any reference to the false information is going just to activate what is our deep conviction, and that is going to lead to even stronger belief in all kinds of nonsense. So what are the thoughts and associations that define our beliefs? Well, in the brain, we have large number of neural processes and going on all the time at each moment, thousands of different things. And numerous neural networks will excite and compete with each other. Even the simplest things like touching things or moving our fingers will activate lots of different processes in the brain. And the signal detection theory says that unless this activity is strong enough and can be distinguished from the noise, it should not have any influence on what I say, what I do, what is my behavior, because otherwise we'll be very erratic, we'll be, very incoherent. That happens to many people, of course, if this signal detection is not really robust and stable. People just get excited and do all kinds of strange things. So the first thing is that there should be strong synchronization, a unique state that can be recognized and that then can activate maybe the areas in the part that stores phonological representation of words so that I can express myself in words, or my motor cortex so that I can do some actions. John Locke, 333 years ago, has written very nicely that consciousness is the perception of what is going on in one's own mind. And I can know only what is going on in my mind if this is very clear signal, not just something at the noise level. So we know that most activities will synchronize different parts of the brain. If you think about someone playing instrument, well, it's the tactile feeling, it's the auditory, it's the visual, it's the logic for reading the music sheets, it's the planning of how to do the action, and it's the motor cortex. Everything in the brain has to synchronize up to milliseconds. Otherwise, it will not sound correctly. So all this synchronization depends on how neurons communicate with each other. Neurons will send the pulses, the spikes, and can synchronize with other neurons, and the action potentials are responsible for transmission of information. And surprisingly, at the macro level, when we transmit information by expressing this in words or our behavior, we can actually send this information to other brains at high level, and they can interpret that in many different ways depending on their own network of ideas or conceptual networks that they have. So transmission using words happens to be better than sending neural spikes. If we just could communicate brain to brain by sending spikes, it looks like we're going just to send very specific information that the other brain will have problems to transform and understand to its own kind of conceptual framework. There are actually first papers based on information theory, where people try to analyze what is called the emergence of causality at the higher level. There is a nice paper, when the map is better than the territory, because the territory is all this information about what neurons are doing, and the map is just how we pass the information in the symbolic way. And there are first papers also where people try to analyze how we should look at that from the point of view of dynamical systems. The brain is a dynamical system. That's a nice metaphor, of course, but it's a fairly good way to describe what happens with the brain. So we can look at memes as memory patterns, and they're much less stable than genes, of course. And memes as parts of these dynamical systems would be attractors of neurodynamics. What are the attractors? Well, we have quasi-stable activation states in the brain. And the attractors try to, suck in different kind of activity and form a quasi-stable synchronized state for a short time. In 1992, Daniel Amit, who worked in Jerusalem and Rome, has written a book, Modeling Brain Function, The World of Attractor Neural Networks. I've invited him to a conference in Zakopane, and we had many discussions. And unfortunately, not too many people learn this language. I thought this is going to develop much faster, but there are now some people who write about more detailed models of how we learn. For example, these Japanese guys writing about the formation of attractor landscape via cholinergic presynaptic modulation. So some people working on real neuroscience are now trying to use this language to understand what happens and how these attractor patterns are modified by, neurotransmitters like acetylcholine. Okay, our behavior depends on how these neural networks are connected to each other, how they focus and synchronize. And if we look at different brain regions, we see a lot of synchrony, which is local, much less between different large-scale systems. And so this is what people try to do now, understand these large-scale systems. And when we look at simple images, let's say we are waiting for the light change. There are just 3 colors and simple geometry, and we are preparing for action. So what happens in our brain? Well, people try to make maps of activity of the cortex based on different images and videos and auditory stimulation, stories, etc., and try to see how these concepts are represented as activity in our brain. So for example, here we are paying attention to what happens. So visual attention, IPS, this red blob here. Okay, there is a color. The color is mostly the activity of this area V4, the visual area 4. And there is the object recognition. This is AC. This is what you see here. And of course, there is a planning of our action, and we still think about doing something. So lots of activity in the prefrontal cortex areas. So sometimes we can understand this activity in form of what different parts of the brain are doing and how to give meaning to certain words. For example, we look at all kinds of criminal stories, and we start to associate murder. The brain is, when we think about murder or see this or hear about murder, the brain has a lot of activity in different brain areas. This red one, and then the blue ones are below the average. And so people have tried to understand how the semantics is expressed in the brain. And you can find a very nice interactive tool in the Gallant Lab in Berkeley, which was created about 6 years ago. And there is also a short movie, which is a nature movie, which is really quite nice. I'm going to play that to you, although you can't hear the sound, unfortunately. But this is what people in the Gallant Lab try to do. They try to see which words or concepts are activating which parts of the brain. So here you see the brain, and it is actually full of words written on that. Now the cortex is flattened, and when the cortex is flattened, you can see a bit better that there are certain brain areas which will activate when you think about the ball, steel, silver, lots of concepts that they picked up from more than 2 hours of video. So they had like 7 people in the scanner, and people were hearing, or rather watching, videos for more than 2 hours, and certain scenes were repeated. And then they could actually say, okay, how is the brain activity changed when you hear all these things, or the story shown in video is related to some of these concepts? Yes, at least once, for example. I mean, a bit abstract concept, right? And you can actually use this interactive tool to flatten the cortex, to look around, to select categories of words, etc. It's all done with functional magnetic resonance now. And so there are different types of things: social, personal, body part, visual objects, outdoor time, etc. And people try to assign to small parts, patches of the brain, all kinds of words which activate them, and the strongest ones only, because they are activated by lots of other things. And having this this kind of activity, they can actually make a map of lots of things that activate our brains. Okay, so I'm not going really to, you can find this nature video, of course, in the YouTube and on the nature site. Okay, we cannot do it yet with EEG or MEG. I would really love to see the maps like that done with faster, temporal resolution. So each voxel can be related to lots of different concepts depending on which subnetwork is activated. Okay, and they've done that for more than 1,700 words. So they have a kind of a semantic space atlas where you just can click on that and see how the brain activity in general looks like when you think or you see certain plants, for example, containers and other things like that. Okay, so doing this type of experiments, one thing that you can also do is that you can compare how correlated are different parts of the brain in case of people who are healthy and in case of people who suffer from, let's say, schizophrenia, autism spectrum disorder, major depression, etc. And then you can find that in case of problems which are psychological problems, psychiatric disease of all sorts, there is less flow of information between different parts of the brain. And so you can combine this estimation of how much information is flowing and create an index. And if the index will be high for ASD, then you're rather convinced that these people suffer from autism. And it agrees in about 85% of cases in Japan, but the same data transformed or used for the US patients is accurate in about 75%. And there are various reasons why it's not really 100%, but you can do it for major depression, you can do it for schizophrenia, lots of other things. So for the first time, we have a real biomarkers showing that this information flow in the brain has something to do with, mental problems. And except for just having static picture, we can also see how things are changing when you hear the story and it unfolds. For example, there are causes, there are characters, there are goals, objects, and space and time is changing, and people try to follow that as a dynamic process. How different parts of the cortex actually activate in case of time perception, in case of object perception, space, goals, characters, etc. Okay, so to understand it in more details and relate that to conspiracies and memes, we have to look more closely at the memory formation. And one of the structures which is critical for memory formation is this red part here, which is the hippocampus. Hippocampus is a part of the old cortex, and it is surrounded by entorhinal cortex, for example. In Polish, it's kora okołowęchowa. So this is related to olfactory perception. Very old brain system. perirhinal parahippocampal cortex. It's mainly hippocampus, which is composed of 3 parts, but also a few other things around that. And it has many functions. It is responsible for spatial memory, and people have found lots of cells of different types that actually are activated by head direction, by the grid where we are in the space, by the fact that there are borders in the space that we cannot cross, and even things like we can measure the speed of our movements because there are some speed cells. And all this information is collected in place cells. And consolidation of long-term memory is one thing that actually hippocampus is responsible for. And we know a bit about also the mechanism at the low level, which is the molecular level that's responsible for these changes. So that's another nice movie, long-term potentiation and memory formation. Okay. The sensory information comes to hippocampus, and hippocampus is relating that to the place cells and the special relations. So all information somehow is related to our ability to navigate and move into space. And then it's sent back to the same brain areas in the cortex. So lots of things happens at the synaptic level, and I don't have time to really go through all this. But when we look at the details, you can see that the details depend on how this information is transmitted through the synaptic gaps. The glutamate, which is one of the neurotransmitters, is influencing receptors which are opening and closing, and the magnesium, which we hear about the supplements all the time, is just pushed from this MDA receptor, and then all the ions, the Na, Ca, K plus, etc., all these ions will flow in and out because the receptors are now open. Now, one receptor, one ion channel can transmit something like 100 million ions per second. And we have like 10,000 of these ion channels in a neuron. So it's like billions of ions flowing in and out, which finally lead to the action potential, and the neuron is going to send some spikes. But learning depends on how these receptors react to the stimulation, and there are molecular mechanisms at the level of proteins that build these structures in the long-term potentiations. But I have no time to talk about that. I will just mention that in 2014, the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine has been given to John O'Keefe and the Moser couple, May-Britt and Edward Moser. And this has been given for the discovery of, well, O'Keefe, the hippocampus is a cognitive map. These are the Nobel Prize lectures titles. And May-Britt Moser was talking about grid cells, place cells, and memory. And Edward Moser was talking about grid cells and the entorhinal maps of space. And they call it the GPS brain system. Grid cells, the head direction cells, the border cells, all project to hippocampal place cells. And the mapping system provides 2 independent strategies. One is based on the landmarks. The sensory cortex is sending information about our relation in the space related to landmarks. And then the other is based on the path integration system, which is using information about how far that we travel in each direction and which cells will then get highly active. So what is really amazing is that this is such an old universal mechanism that even ants are measuring distance counting steps. I never thought that something like that may happen in the ant brain, which has just a few tens of thousands of neurons. In the rat brains, they found cells which are speedometers, which then measure, how fast the rat is moving. So all this is fairly complex, and I will not talk about that, but the grid cells are in this region, the boundary cells are in this region, and the place cells are in the CA1 region of the hippocampus. and head direction cells are found in this region. So lots of different, very specific mechanisms that allow us to orient ourselves in the space have been associated with hippocampus. And when we move, actually, there is like a perception spot, and you can see that the cells in hippocampus are connecting these spots, creating all kinds of structures, which will then activate the cells depending on where we are in our environment. Maybe rat in the maze is something that has been most often investigated. And so people started recently, actually, to use topological analysis to model these processes. For example, they found that all these place cells relate to each other in a way that is not really possible to describe at the flat space, that rather there are complexes which go up to 7 dimensions or even more that have to be used to describe the relations of activity between the cells. All this is very important and interesting. And even more interesting is that very recently, people started to look at the hippocampus and said, okay, the special navigation allows us to make inferences. The black lines are the lines I've traveled, but then the red lines are something that I can infer because there is kind of transition co-activation between the place cells here and there. And so if I think how to get from one place to the other, my place cells are going to tell me that there is a certain organization of space that I can use. And surprisingly, people found that this same mechanism is somehow also used for more abstract concept representation. So if we have a family tree, grandmother and grandfather, and then the daughter has a husband, and she has a daughter, and the son has a son. And so inference that these are cousins is something that the cognitive maps in the hippocampus are also able to do. And lots of recent experiments are made to show how this whole thing works. Okay, so one thing that people have been using for centuries, actually, even 2,500 years ago in ancient Greece, is all this memory-based techniques, the mnemonic techniques or memory palace, the method of Wlodzislaw, as it was called. The space is used as a framework to store memories. If you want to remember something, all these mnemonic techniques will tell you, okay, think about a place that you know very well and try to attach the ideas, the things that you want to remember to different objects in this space. That is very widely used. And now we understand why it works, and that this is the hippocampus place cells which play such a universal role. So now, to understand all this better and to relate that to such a complex things like conspiracy theories, we need to simplify this. The greatest simplification you can do for hippocampus is that you treat it as a link. That is, this is the cortex. The information, as you've seen, is now traveling to hippocampus, to place cells, and attached to certain places. So I remember, for example, where I keep things in my computer, or where I found it in a book. I may not remember the details, but I remember the place sometimes, right? And so the cortex first sent the information to hippocampus. The hippocampus, if this is something interesting, then there is lots of neuromodulation, the structures that will release all kinds of neurotransmitters will make it plastic. So the system changes and remembers, okay, this was the place and this was the activity. And then the hippocampus actually can consolidate this memory by reactivating the cortex, especially during sleep, very quickly, reactivating the cortex. So finally, because hippocampus is not so big, not so many cells, finally, actually, any cue is going to activate some parts of the cortex, and these parts of the cortex are going to activate the others. This is the long-term memory that even if people have damage to their brains and start to suffer from amnesia, they can recall old memories because they're deeply encoded in the cortical activation and they don't require hippocampus anymore. So the simple model is actually explaining lots of features. I learned it from Jaap Murray ages ago when we met drinking beer in one of the bars in Cambridge in UK. And I think this is a very useful model. So to understand things at the let's say model level, we have to create biologically plausible neural networks, and these networks have to have different types of channels, which will be excitatory synaptic inputs, inhibitory synaptic inputs, but also the leak channels. And the leak channels are very important. Lots of neurons are flowing out and they depolarize the neurons so that these neurons are not going to work for a very long time, because otherwise we'll just focus on things and not being able to move our attention or to change what we focus on to other things. And there are different types of these channels. I focused on these 2-pore K+ channels and proteins and genes that can be linked to that. And I thought that actually they're very important for autistic problems, ASD. So one way to really model that is to create this kind of a model of reading, where we have the parts of the brain that can actually recognize the letters. Let's say this is called the world form brain area, the world form brain area, discovered not that long time ago. And I can read without thinking what I read, because there is the transformation from the what I read to phonological inputs, and so I can read it loud. But to understand what I read, I have to activate the rest of the cortex, the semantics, to get these maps that you have seen that the Gallant Lab has created. And then the semantics is then also activating phonology. And then I understand what I read, basically. So we can do this kind of experiments. And for example, if I click on that, you will see how quickly that changes. Oops. And the transition between one attractor state, which is responsible for semantics, for this distribution of maps, to another attractor state is very quick. And you see the activity of different brain regions as this little boxes, right? So you see it jumps from one to the other very quickly. Okay. So I can actually try to model these transitions and understand the whole dynamics, the trajectory of these transitions, by creating recurrence plots. The recurrence plots will allow us to see how similar this distribution of the semantics activity in the semantic layer is to the distribution that was a moment ago, a few moments ago. So if it's very similar, then the distance is close to 0 and I have a black square, right? So the time is flying, passing by, and I have these squares which are sometimes very black, which means the system is in the attractor and it doesn't move too much. And sometimes it's quickly moving to other attractors, to other concepts which are related to it. And sometimes it tries to relate the current state to the previous states, which allow us to understand better the situation. So this kind of simulation, but also this kind of analysis that we now try to do to see how brains actually understand the meaning of the stories, of the words, is something that we're very much interested in. And to see it better, we can visualize the trajectory. Each dot here is this activity of this 140 different brain regions that we are observing, right? And we see that from time to time it slows down, the trajectory slows down, and it makes kind of a blob. So that means that it's fluctuating around maybe quasi-stable distribution, right? So the brain has about 3 million of columns. Each column there will be like 30,000 neurons and hundreds of millions of connections. And all these columns may form actually different synchronized activity with other columns. So all this is very complex picture, of course. So we just need to simplify it to understand it better. So if I look not at a very simple things, but more complex picture, I see the brain has lots of different brain areas, and all these columns synchronized highly and highly active here. And there are sometimes fast transitions that depends on the type of processes at the elementary neural level. For example, the leak currents. If the leak currents are strong, neurons quickly depolarize, and you have situations like that. Okay, I've been focused, and then just fleeting thoughts, nothing happens. And then again, I focus on something, right? So I'll just see these jumps like this with little metastable areas where there'll be few dots, and then the system jumps out. And so you can compare, depending on how these neurons could be constructed, what kind of channels we have and how strongly they can synchronize. You can compare different situations and find that, for example, the leak channels may change the situation from highly focused and very few states, which could be like in case of ASD, autistic people just focus and stay focused on one thing, and it's very hard to move their attention to another things. It could be just average, normal, and it could be like in a case of ADHD, jumping from one to the other all the time when the leak channels are very opened and very quickly neurons are depolarizing and jumping. So we understand quite a few things and actually can try to predict what will happen with such systems when you have a fast presentation of stimuli, etc. We really would like to have behavioral experiments showing how this trajectory change. There are different visualization methods to see that. We can try to link each of the states that we see in the Gallant map with the simulated states and see how frequently transitions happen between different states, etc. And just the last part, the conspiracy will finally get you. What was that, 97, I think, we had the Hale-Bopp comet, right? There were like 30 people who killed themselves because they thought their souls are going to travel to the Hale-Bopp comet and leave this planet. And these people were actually creating web pages in San Diego mostly. So they're not primitive, naive people. They were more educated. So how people start to believe in conspiracies? Well, Emily Dickinson, a famous poet in English-speaking world, has written, "The soul selects its own society and then shuts the door." And that is what is happening. The soul is selecting its own society. And I will just show you a very simple simulation how that happens. So there are different scenarios that you can invent that I wanted to explore, but I've written in a paper, in the recent paper, only about one. The emotional situation is creating a situation in which the system becomes highly plastic. The neuroplasticity grows because of the neurotransmitter release, and this leads to a fast learning because it must be an important situation. But the fast learning has high probability of wrong interpretation. And the problem is when this, what we have learned very inaccurately and quickly, is frozen, and then it draws all these states, as I showed you in another picture, all these attractor states are drawn to another attractor states. And then we have a whole big complex of the attractor states. Whatever comes to the brain is kind of associated with these states, and the neurodynamics thinks in these states. So conspiracy theories will form around such association. Frozen pathways lead to brain activity forming strong attractors and distort rational thinking. And such strong associations save brain energy, and cannot be changed by rational arguments, unfortunately. That will influence only the weaker associations, and the explanations become quite obvious. So there are different ways of simulating that. For example, I've used this self-organized networks, different competitive learning techniques to show that. Let's imagine that you've learned about the world, and these are your concepts. So this network of concepts I was talking about is related to each other, and we just cover a certain area of our knowledge roughly correctly, because we have all these dots now. Each dot represents the activity of the whole cortex, right? But unfortunately, we just see a small patch, and suddenly we start to focus very quickly on different things because emotions go up. And so we haven't heard many things, but some things we have heard many times. And so this network becomes, well, full of blobs that will just try to, bring certain facts together. Okay. Definitely, all these vaccines are going to make us susceptible to 5G, right? Everybody knows that now we're going to be controlled by people in telecommunication. So once this becomes serious and the number of these blobs is growing, then we start to believe in all kinds of, we try to associate all kinds of information with the core that has state in our brain. We just can't help it. This is association. This is what comes to my mind, right? And so, well, it must be true. And finally, we have a situation in which people become memoids, because everything has been associated with the great cause, the great leader that is going to tell us the truth. Nothing else matters. So I'm going to show you how that happens very quickly with just one live simulation, I hope, if I can find that now, because we've opened quite a few things. Okay, look at what will happen here. I'll just restart that. So this is what we know. Okay, this is what we roughly know about the world. That's our conceptual space. But then we've subscribed to a certain social media, and we just spend most of our time there, and we just read one kind of newspapers, and we watch one kind of TV. And the situation is that, well, when we look at what happens to our conceptual map, we find that it's getting associated more and more with just what we have read. I like what I know, and I know what I like, and that's it. Even though there are other events that happen here, they have no influence on the core beliefs that I have. And you can see that these core beliefs are sucking in all the knowledge that I had from the, well, peripheral areas. Everybody has the core knowledge, which just makes them the member of this group, football fan, political fan, religious fan, whatever, and have very different worldviews in all other respects, because every time I restart that, you see that this picture is very different. Right. So the only thing that stays constant is that lots of states of our brain, the concepts or the beliefs that I have, are going to be associated with my core beliefs. So actually, I've seen the movie about the terrorists in Indonesia, and they try to really, talk with them, and they found that it may not be possible because their brains are completely brainwashed. The associations that they have are like this. The only way of changing that will be to have strong electric shocks. Okay, we try to improve these models by making all kinds of real models on these newspaper clips, etc., with Julian Szymański now from the Gdańsk Polytechnics. And just to finish, okay, people try to find out how to create these core concepts that we can use for communication and how to share the concepts. and even speculate about sending information from one brain to the other. So you can read EEG states and then try to activate with magnetic pulses the state of the other brains. And if you will have enough wires, you're going to activate them much more precisely. But as I mentioned, there is this paper by Hoel on emergence as the conversion of information and the conceptual emergence that makes it doubtful that it will work better. So this idea of direct brain activation and pumping information in our brain is fortunately not close in time, but Sony has a patent for direct streaming of multimedia information to the brain. So who knows what will happen if Musk will succeed in putting wires in our brains, and if Sony will succeed to put, the games into our brains, and whether this kind of little heads where some electrodes are running currents are not going to mix our brain. The final slide is this this idea that if we look at the links between ecology, food production, culture, we can find out that the collectivist individual division in China, Bali, Turkey, and other places have very deep genetic roots and roots in behavior. In China, rice was domesticated 10,000 years ago, and it requires massive communal work. And to transform the ecosystem, to create this terrace, for example, irrigation, harvesting together, dividing water, all this is the communal work. In Bali, for example, the water temples are the most important. In Western China, you have these irrigation systems, which are like over 5,000 square kilometers, and they have been created 2,000 years ago. These people had to work together to make a living. And in some part of China, there are people who are much more individual because they grow wheat and they have smaller fields and they don't rely on the large groups working together. They show high inventiveness, their patent feelings and higher rates of divorce and lots of other things. And you may find out that they have actually different receptors in the reward system. The DRD4 gene is coding the dopamine D4 receptors. And there are 25 human variants of this gene. And most common is the 4R variant, which is in half of Asians and Europeans. And then there is 7R variants, which produces a receptor which is less responsive to dopamine in the cortex, which means that people have to look for new things to be happy to activate their reward system. There is a bigger tendency to extroversion, impulsivity, etc. And this gene became active or more common about 10 to 20,000 years ago. And it occurs in about 20 to 30% of Europeans and European Americans, and only 1% of East Asians who do this communal work. So you see this combination of ecology, living style, food production, culture, genes. Now, at the top of it, we have social media, and the world is out of balance, changing very quickly. And so we can actually accommodate a lot of different things in our brain. So unfortunately, conspiracies are sometimes true, and I can recommend you The History of Greatest Lies, the French movies, that I've seen few of these, and I've seen how politicians have been cheating in all kinds of cases and lying to the public in face. And there are different, let's say there are like 20 different films now showing in details the story of Nixon, Bush wars, Trump nonsense, Madoff fraud of 65 billion pyramid, Mitterrand lying in all kinds of cases, and sinking Greenpeace ship in New Zealand and that killed one person. Also Chirac lying, Putin lying, Enron lying, Holmes lying, etc. So how can we really believe anyone and be sure that what we hear is something that is true? Some of this has been done within our Symphonia 4 project in search of the sources of brain cognitive activity. with lots of people from Warsaw Nensky Institute and Institute of Physiology and Pathology of Hearing. Our students are taking part in different hackathons, trying to really read brain signals and understand what they mean and how to use them. And that's about it. So thank you for your attention and synchronizing your neurons.
Thank you very much, Włodek, for very nice, as usual, and very interesting talk. So we still have time for questions or comments, whatever. Just raise a hand. UMK, I don't know who is that guy, but...
It's me, Grzegorz.
Okay.
Grzegorz is UMK.
Yeah, I don't know. It sometimes connects me like UMK, and you never know what WebEx. It's not much intelligent. A wonderful lecture, Włodek. Congratulations. I was waiting for such a lecture for centuries, because even a few years ago in Polish Wikipedia, there was information that the brain, the visible brain, is in one part and the speech is located in another part and hearing in another part. Now I checked, it disappeared happily. But your talk reminded me the words of Stanley Yaki in a short book, Mind and Brain. And he says his conclusion to the question, where is the mind in the brain? He answers, everywhere and nowhere. So this is a really great picture showing how complex is our brain. Congratulations.
Thank you. Indeed, it's very complex, but I think actually I have this feeling, when I started to look at that years ago, we did not understand anything. I had lots of nonsense books about consciousness and paranormal stuff and things like that. Step by step, I've learned some things. And I have this very pleasant feeling that we start to understand a bit. It's still something for generations to explore. But we already understand quite a few things, and it's a very pleasant feeling that, this idea, for example, that hippocampus and the whole system of navigation and special relations and cognition can be also responsible for abstract thinking was a kind of revelation, and it's very new. So I'm quite happy about that. But on the other hand, I have so many papers now which are extremely interesting, and I have no time to really read them thoroughly. That it's a kind of depression.
Okay. I'm not sure. I saw Andrzej. You wanted to ask? Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yes. Go ahead.
Please.
Well, Włodek, thank you very much. This was very interesting presentation. And I'm doing a little bit of amateurish reading on subjects which are somewhat related. And I'm curious, for my taste, I like the last slide. And I would be much happier if you would start it with this by showing, that there are some really very large differences. That innateness is a very important subject. I think that you put too much stress on memes, and that would be my question. Of course, I'd be happy if you comment on my comment, but the question would be this. Well, the question would be of nature and nurture. Where do memes belong? Can you give some biological base to memes, or are they of purely cultural origin? Is there any meme gene interaction? That's your last presentation, the last slide, on which you show this Bali case, which is discussed in the book I read recently. It's very interesting because that's the example in which shows how religion helps people to organize and to support larger communities which have to collaborate and cooperate in order to survive simply. And that was not only like you mentioned, I think at some part 2,000 or 3,000 years, that was millions of years, because our brains started building up millions of years ago. They are almost as old as the history of life on this planet, right?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
you know, there are so
told at the
many
beginning.
detailed questions, but I'm not sure. This one about memes, I think it's the most important one. The next one, it's more technical. What do you think? You said that when we read text, we have to activate the rational thinking, right? The biggest, the slowest thinking, but we have also quick thinking, which we call intuition. There are probably some built-in things which let us, you know, react immediately when we see snake. Then there is this face recognition, which comes easily. You know, we get scared when we walk when it's dark because we can immediately see, you know, that somebody is going to attack us, even if we know it's not true. It's we are safe, but that's what happens. So, well, I would be happy if you could comment on this. The last one, if I may, it's you talked about Democrats and Republicans and their political differences. I think it's very important because we have about the same in our country. Division is so strong that we can no longer talk to each other, and that's too bad. And we should try to understand our differences. And again, there is a book I read lately, Righteous Mind, by Jonathan Haidt, and it's very interesting. And you know, I found there, I think, I think that there were some studies that brains actually differ. That you may have, he gives an example of a girl and a boy, siblings, born in the same family, brought together, but you know, they pick up very different life ways. They choose for themselves quite different styles and so on. One is Republican, the girl is liberal, and you know, he thinks that our brains are programmed somewhat, right? And that's a, you know, very important thing. How would you comment on all of this? And maybe this question about memes is the most important, and you can pick up whatever would suit you from the rest.
Okay. Short comment. Haidt, I've been really recommending that to many people. He is a great sociologist, let's say. They've been looking at the values of people who are Democrats and Republicans and try to understand that in terms of values. Again, relating things like values, whether I really, think that trustworthiness and truth that I speak, etc., is more important than loyalty and other things. We don't know how to relate these things to how brains work. As I mentioned, for many years, I've tried to publish the paper and try to convince people doing research on conspiracy theories that the brains are important. And they simply rejected that because there are sociologists, there are historians, there are, you know, literature critics, and they don't want to learn about the brain and hear about the brain. And so we know very little about that. People in neuroscience have not picked it up as a topic. There are no journals. I've tried maybe 7 or 8 different journals, and they tried to find reviewers for the paper, and they finally said, well, you know, no one wants to review that because it doesn't fit anywhere. So I think this is something that will happen, but we still don't know many things. So I like Haidt very much, but I haven't seen any attempts to connect his ideas and understanding of the differences between Democrats and Republicans and political divisions, etc. Whole groups of people are working on political divisions in the US. But unfortunately, we don't have yet much knowledge about how that is related to the brains. The fact that genes influence our brains, that's obvious. And at the beginning, I showed you different things that, I mean, a nice picture. Okay, what happens 1 second before, what happens a minute before, etc. This is what Robert Sapolsky in his book, which is now in Polish also, has been writing. And he said, okay, look at the hormones and how they influence our behavior within the day or so. And but what really influences my immediate action is frequently called priming in psychology. And these are short-term, very quick things. So so think about the brain as something that really changes because of neuroplasticity, changes over time, and has some structures built in through evolution, which will be millions of years. And this is in this multi-level phenomics too, right? They're very slow processes. But what really has influence on my immediate action is what I have been primed by, let's say, looking at TV in the morning or talking with my wife, etc. And suddenly I start to notice things because something happened just minutes before. This is what Sapolsky, who is a professor at Stanford, is describing in details in his book, which has like 800 pages actually. So we have very few cases where what I showed at the end could be demonstrated. That is that genes have great influence on, or rather that genes have been selected because of the communal work, and the fact that they exist allowed this communal work to happen. So all these pictures that we have now are very holistic in the sense that we just cannot separate the cause and effect. These cause and effects are, somehow reciprocal in most of these. There are famous cases that I've been teaching students in the taboos in Western Africa, where people will not eat ingam, which is the main food that they have, because they believe that some demons are going to attack them, etc. But it appeared to be related to genetics and the fact that they die of malaria, and this ingam is actually preventing them to develop sickle cell anemia, which if it's not really in two strings of DNA, but just in one, then people are not dying, but become more resistant to malaria. All these things are very complex, but these are slow effects which have to have enough time to develop. So when you think about the Bali water temple and religion mixed with culture and, all the livelihood, this requires time. Now we're talking about things that happen day after day because somebody is just throwing into the social media some idiotic idea saying, okay, this is not a hospital, but this is a chemical weapon factory. What can you do about that, right? And this is not something that can be explained by genetics and slow processes. This is a very fast process, which is activating the dynamic network, which can store things very quickly because things that we hear either fit to our conceptual framework and we think, okay, they're true and they are going to be activated next time we think about these things, or are rejected because we think it's completely false, and so we look for other information, right? So all this is fairly complex. And when I showed you this picture, this is, of course, also part of the quick thinking. Kahneman has invented that two kind of systems: the slow, conscious, systematic and sequential thinking, and then quick thinking, which is based on our gut reactions, of course. But still, these gut reactions are either leading directly to action, which is subcortical activity mostly, or actually will influence our cortex and lead to, let's say, cognitive analysis of what happens. So again, I also show that to students that when you look at the visual system and you try to understand why we just jump when we see that we have stepped on a stick and it jumps up. I mean, there is a short, quick pathways which does not have to activate our cortex at all, because this is important for survival. So all these things we know, but if I had focused on any of this, I will have absolutely no time to tell you about things which are related to real, memes and things which I tend to see rather at the level of neurodynamics and quick changes. And so the time scales have to be separated. Otherwise, we're going to talk about everything at once and we will not get anywhere. Okay.
Okay, thank you. I saw the, I don't know, Piesiek, you wanted to ask question or?
Oh, yes, I had a lot of questions, but we are running out of time.
Just one.
Just one. Włodek, could you give us a short definition of this conspiracy theory? This is question 1A. And 1B, do you believe that there is any single person who does not believe in any conspiracy theory? I have suspicion that third person does not exist in our country, at least.
That is obviously dependent on how you define the conspiracy theory, right? I mean, if people try to associate everything with some simple idea and just try to explain everything in this way, I don't think the psychologists came up with something like that. From my point of view, or from the point of view of experiments that computational experiments that I'm trying to do, that this is when you see this big let's say association of different attractor states that try to mix themselves together, and because of that lots of cues are ending up with the same brain state. So at the brain level, I think we could define, well, some criteria to say how it is. At the psychological level, well, yes, I mean, some people have mild conspiracies because they suspect, and sometimes they're true, like they suspect that the supplements that are sold to us are not really worth much, right? Okay, there's a lot of research showing that most of the supplements are not really doing much except for taking our money. But on the other hand, if you just look at TV channels like the History Channel, they show pictures about the ancient aliens all the time. And they talk such a nonsense about everything they see that it must be because of aliens. Any piece of stone that they find somewhere, now the aliens have made it, right? If they find the stories from ancient Indian texts that people have been flying on the carpets, now this is the aliens, obviously, right? I mean, you see that these people associate everything that they find with their idea. And this is typical conspiracy theory, right? But okay, psychologists have written enough. And if you are really interested, 800 pages produced by the COST project will just tell you that, there are hundreds of conspiracy theories, and some of them are quite old, actually, Illuminati and other stuff like that. I'm sure that I could give a much more entertaining talking about all this nonsense, because it's sometimes so ridiculous and a lot of fun to hear about that, right? But obviously we would like to understand the mechanisms.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we are running over time, so I can stop now the seminar. Once more, Włodek, thank you very much for very interesting talk and for answering question and discussion, and thank you everyone for attending. So I don't know if I can say, but if somebody wants to ask Włodek right now if he's not to try it, I'm not closing the meeting, so it's
okay.
No, but Włodek, that's your decision.
Yeah,
so I know that you are tired after the lecture.
I still can breathe, so it's okay.
Okay, okay. Thank you once more. Widzę, że ja już nie będę tego moderował, tak? Tutaj jesteśmy razem. Więc...
Irek, może się na polski przełączymy. Ja nie wiem, ile osób się przysługuje za
granicą. To chciałem powiedzieć, tak?
Włodziu, no ciekawe rzeczy, ale jeśli można już poza konkursem. A nie sądzisz, że tak naprawdę wyjaśnienie tej całej teorii konspiracji, czy występowania ich